Anuj, we can start.
Okay. So welcome everyone. We are on C City, and I am Anuj Daga. I am an assistant professor at the School of Environment and Architecture, and uh, I am very happy to introduce you to C City, which is the school's outreach program. And as a part of this program, we organize lectures, events, symposia, and exhibitions in order to engage with the larger artistic and cultural discursive sphere within and outside the city. Under this, we run programs like See Conversations, where we invite people for conversations, as well as See Emerging Practices, where we have invited young practices which are doing some alternative kind of works in through their tools. So I'm very happy to welcome you on the day of Dashera, which is a festive day today in Bombay, from and to people all around the world. I'm very also excited to inform that this series of Sea City has been supported by Urban Center Mumbai. A short introduction to Urban Center Mumbai. It's a part of the Urban Center Trust, which is a young not-for-profit organization. It was established in 2020 by city practitioners, and it aims to build capacities and create democratic platforms to achieve and demonstrate excellence in the planning and design of rapidly growing urban agglomerations in India. A little bit about our series. This is also the last session, and I would like to kind of, remind everyone and also introduce any new people in our room about how this series came up. The idea of building agency kind of was triggered by Supreme Court's announcement last year that in India, one doesn't need to have an architectural degree to create or build anything in India. And that led us to thinking that how is it that we have come to this point where architecture almost has become a degree which is not required, which is not felt essential for aiding the built environment. And this is what led us to questioning the role of agency that we as architects hold, and the role and the agency that buildings hold in shaping societies. So building agency is this twofold, it holds this twofold idea, and it aims to address the question of how does architecture become relevant for or relevant in society today. And like I said, there are two main dimensions to this question. One is that how does spatial design shape societal relationships? And how could a spatial practitioners contribute responsibly and potently into the emerging complexities of spatial operation today? And in order to kind of interrogate and open these two questions, the series invites spatial practitioners who have been formulating visions, trajectories, questions, methods, and processes through which environmental apparatus may be configured afresh. So we are hoping that these discussions will offer useful directions for contemporary spatial pedagogy and practice. So far, we have had 7 presenters in this series, and they've kind of opened up a range of things. We have had people from India as well as across the globe, and today we have our last speaker for this session, who will allow us to expand on this idea of building agency. And it is the title of the talk is very aptly framed, called Other Ways of World Making. And to present this, we'll have Sarosh Anklesaria. Just a short introduction to Sarosh. Sarosh is the T. David Fitzgibbon Professor of Architecture and track chair of the MArch program at the Carnegie Mellon University. His work synthesizes architectural agency with questions of socio-ecological justice. His current design research has been supported by the Richard Rogers Fellowship from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, the Taliesin Fellowship, and the Art OMI residency. His project, the Urban Symbiome, has been published in several in expansions, responses to how will we live together, which was published as a part of the Venice Biennial 2021. His writing, design, research, and advocacy work has been published in several newspapers and magazines and journals across, which include the New York Times, the Architectural Review, Domus, Architects Newspaper, and Design Today. He has worked as an architect for Diller Scofidio and Renfro, Hazog de Muron, as well as B.V. Doshi in India. He holds a diploma in architecture from Sept University, Ahmedabad, and a post-professional master of architecture from the Cornell University. So with that, I would like to invite Sarosh to open up today's conversation and deliver his presentation. So, Sarosh, over to you.
Thank you, Anuj. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you for the invitation, and thank you to Rupali and Prasad for making this possible, for inviting me. And happy Dashera to everyone who is joining from all over the world. I'm greatly honored, and I am very thankful. So I'm going to share my screen, and I will jump right into it. So please tell me if it sort of works for you.
Yes, we can.
I'm going to share the second screen. Yeah. Does that work?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So thank you again, and I'm going to talk about mostly recent things that I have been up to, and somehow also my preoccupation with questions of agency. So one has to sort of begin with the problem of disciplinary divides, because I think architecture as a profession, certainly for several decades, has struggled with this notion of do we even need to be useful in the world? And so to unpack that a little, I would like to use this talk as an opportunity to re-entangle the schism. This is an old schism that comes from the sciences, that comes from disciplinary silos, probably comes from the Enlightenment, that every discipline has somehow its borders, and things are therefore disciplinary. And so questions that are at the core of the discipline or the disciplinary interior need to be connected to and are certainly always in dialogue, in a dialectic with the disciplinary exterior. And really, agency is the act of stitching these together, is the act of unpacking what might be called purely disciplinary, and even sort of obliterating this schism entirely, right? And so I locate agency at the center of this re-entangling, as it were. Agency is considered here to be architecture's own transformative capacity to enact, affect, and inspire socio-ecological change. While a relatively new term in architectural discourse, agency has a long history in social and political theory and is often described as the ability of the individual to act independently of the constraining structures of society. And here, of course, the term structure implies a kind of Marx, the way in which Marx would sort of theorize structure as a kind of default rubric within which actions occur. And so structure seen, agency seen as structure in this sense is really how society is organized. And Anthony Giddens further problematizes this dialectic between agency and structure by suggesting that agents, like ourselves, are neither completely free as individuals, nor are they completely entrapped in structure. And this really is a bit of a breakthrough, because it allows, for example, someone like Tatiana Bilbao in her now famous introduction to the book Spatial Agency, to suggest that agency implies that action to engage transformatively with structure is possible and will only be effective insofar as one understands both the constraints and the opportunities that the structure presents. So with this, I will demonstrate three sort of ways by which I, in my own sort of small ways, have attempted to engage with structure, not architectural structure, but societal structure through architectural actions. So in the first case, through building project. In the second case, through activism, and in the third case, really through imagining another kind of world, mostly through drawing and writing. And if the normal modus operandi for an architect is to add something physical in the world, I would contend that building alone may not be the only manner through which architectural agency can be deployed. So a very early project, not the start of the first sort of project that I want to talk about, but how did I even get into agency, is I was a very young architect trying to make a building, and I, trained completely in drawing and communicating my work through drawing and models, and purely as in almost informal terms. I was very happy with what we ended up doing. This was in collaboration with Riaz Tayyabji, with whom I run the firm Anthill Design. And we were happy with this, but at the same time, and this was one of our earliest projects, at the same time, I felt I had no agency beyond the form of the building and the choice of materials and so on, but I had no agency over the conditions of the site, which I found to be very, very problematic, with sort of laborers living in these shacks. And these are, things we all know. So it was not a surprise, but the fact that it happened on your own site sort of makes you feel it a little more. And really, it left, I have to say, a lasting impression on me as a young architect. And so I started asking myself, what are the ways in which architecture is socially embedded, and how can buildings, but also how can architects as agents, as agents in the world, exude agency beyond and through the building. So this brings me to the first project, that is, it is not a built project, but it was a competition we did in Malawi. It is a part, and in a part of Malawi, so this is, of course, Malawi, it is landlocked, but it's a part of Malawi called Benga, which has no water, no sewerage, and no electricity. And so it is one of the poorest parts of the world. And this is a competition I did with Ellie Krause, Tess Clancy, and Christopher Yee. And we were also joined by Professor Rachel Kerr from the Department of Sociology, and Auburn Siddle from also the Department of Developmental Sociology. These were all colleagues and friends and students at Cornell. And we collaborated with the sociologists because they had lived in Malawi and they had done extensive work in Malawi and understood Malawi in a way that we could never possibly have. But where it became architectural almost too quickly was that the school needed a new classroom and an expanded classroom, but they pointed us to structures that were built in as schools in Malawi that were not being able to be used because the windows were too small and electricity kept failing, and so students could not read, and so they had to sort of sit out under the tree and do their classes under the tree. And this photograph for me really encapsulates the complete abject failure of architecture to do its most kind of bare minimum thing, which is to provide shelter, and an effective shelter for the students of the school. And so the site had a church that was the parish, and the parish was running the school, but really the conditions, as you can see, were very kind of basic. So we took this kind of failed normative type, and we sort of decided to transform it almost completely, but keep the brick base. And we said, what if we inverted the roof and made it out of metal, but allowed for enough ventilation so that it doesn't get hot, but also so that one can bring light into it. And of course, collected rainwater, because it is a very scarce, rainwater scarce place. And create also these sorts of spaces by splitting the classroom between the buildings that would be shaded, and then extend the roofs to allow for shading, and have a ventilated pit latrine relatively close, because we also know that that there's a lot of violence against women and children that often happen because they have to travel long distances to go to the bathroom. And then if we organize this almost as a kind of mat building that could situate itself along a wind corridor, then we start getting these pockets that are both well shaded, but also bring a sort of a public space to the school. And then really the materials become very, very simple. These are things that are available in a close radius of the of Benga. And the project actually, all of this really is just the setup of the project, but the project really begins with an understanding of the site as really something that should be dealt with temporally, so that one is able to invest small sums of money while building this campus. And so the other big question that we faced while working here was that there is a vast problem of simple nutrition, and so schools are really implicated in nutrition. Schools provide free meals, and so we said, what if we actually connected students to this, to really a productive, edible landscape? And so what if we sort of decided that everything we planted would be things that would be edible, but also things that would relate to the local kind of ecology of the place. And so we get right in the beginning, this is sort of inspired by B.V. Doshi's Aranya, where the infrastructure goes in first. So this is sort of that kind of project, right? Where you put in the public spaces first, you put in the courtyards where, and you plant the trees where you would get fruit trees in the kind of housing clusters. You get these incredibly sort of inspired by Malawi, the Malawian textiles. You get these patterns on the ground, and then you get these planter beds that would allow for edible roots and legumes. And what if the school really then sort of grew incrementally, slowly? So you would get the institutional space right here in the center, but then the housing clusters would sort of develop um, over time. And hence you start developing really a kind of tapestry which allows for us to sort of learn as the process of building unfolds. And like I said, allows for small incremental investments over time. And so the organization of the campus mirrors a reciprocity of architecture and rich permaculture landscapes of indigenous species of grains, legumes, vegetables, and fruits. Selecting plants of various sizes, harvest times, textures, flavors, colors, functions, and lifespans builds a multi-layered, soil-rich, high-yield ecology. We integrate these plants with semi-permeable pathways and an abundance of flowering plants to help maintain the ecological balance of the land. So really students kind of experience a learning both inside and outside of the classroom. And it must be said here that Malawi has lost a lot of its kind of traditional knowledge of how food is really produced. So this would sort of build that knowledge, but also instill it in students at a very young age. And so here you have the classrooms and the spaces in between. And we thought that rituals are important. And so Chitenge textiles, which are the textiles from the region, are things that Malawians are incredibly proud of. And we thought, how wonderful would it be if we would sort of have this kind of ritual of maintenance, care, and repair of the building also ingrained into the life of the school. And hence, we thought that the courtyards of the housing would be spaces that could have this kind of iteratively painted tapestries. And so this brings me to the second aspect of the second sort of piece of this, which is a notion of agency where one considers political and social actions. And so only recently has agency in architecture been theorized in this sense as itself a form of knowledge and action in the world. Architects can make buildings, but architects can certainly also participate in almost a kind of more direct action. And we have a tradition in architecture of acting through manifestos, but also other means, methods that embrace social engagement. And I think that this campaign that I'm about to show you, which was for me really revelatory in just how much is possible through this notion of agency and really acknowledging that one can be an actor in the world. And so strangely enough, modernism, because it sort of operated in its early years through tabula rasa and through, as we know, many demolitions, modernism in a strange way, early modern and late modern buildings in a strange way are now subject to their own sort of ontological tyrannies, because we are seeing them being demolished at a rate that is absolutely incredible. And so across various, but the other side of modernism is also that across various geographies, democratic socialism offered architects state-sponsored patronage for building architectures of social consequence. So much as early modern architecture sort of operated with tabula rasa, at the same time, it must be acknowledged also that modernism was perhaps the first time, almost certainly the first time, that one was able to bring high design or design to a vast population. And modernist architects really embraced this social agency of architecture to do this. And today, some of those most incredible buildings of a certain time, of that time, are being demolished and have been demolished. And so as neoliberalism and laissez-faire capitalism continue to erode the values of a syncretic socialism, we see an overwhelming distrust also in public institutions across the globe. And this corresponds to a worldwide decline of the legacy of the modern movement, its structures, but also what I really want to stress here is the concomitant ideologies of its time. And so when I see this form of destruction, I do not see this only as building artifacts being erased. I see really a certain belief in a political system that has entirely been erased and that continues to sort of constantly be both literally, physically, and intellectually assaulted. And within our own country, in the subcontinent, one sees the same thing play out. These are all buildings that have now been demolished, arguably by India's most famous architects of a certain era. But these are also architects that built the foundations of modern India. So in the subcontinent, the Nehruvian belief in a secular scientific temper for publicly funded institutions laid the foundations of modern India, and the enthusiasm with which these architects instituted and designed these buildings had less to do with their own ideological bent, but really a collective optimism founded in both institutions, but also in a young and newly independent country. And some of these buildings are, of course, a little older than that period, but essentially it is a certain kind of, like I keep saying, not the building is just a symptom of a much deeper condition of neglect. And also of a deeper condition of erasure and replacement that is ideological. And so these are buildings whose fate might very soon be like the others that I showed you. And so while we are building at a tremendous scale, especially in the global south, especially in India, China, and Africa, we are also erasing at a really terrific scale. And the kind of madness of this is that these three buildings are going to be demolished as part of the Central Vista development in New Delhi. But this is really precipitated by us architects, us, I say, because it is an architect who's been hired to develop these plans. And these buildings are the kind of fallout of that sort of utter neglect for both a certain legacy, but also this idea of care and repair, that something should be tended to, and maintenance is somehow part of building a certain memory of a place. All of those things are essential when one looks at something like Navarampura bus station. To be honest, I don't even know if this has already been demolished, but these buildings might go any minute now. The Sanskar Kendra by Le Corbusier, we will come to it in a bit. But really, if anybody has been to these projects, one really already gets a sense, especially with these two, of a certain decline that is really far more symptomatic of the time than just the kind of decline of the built artifact. And so when it was announced that the dormitories by Louis Kahn would be demolished in India, that was for many of us not just a wake-up call, but really a call for a kind of action that had to be activist, that we had to sort of drop our hats as architects and put on or concurrently wear hats as activists, but architectural activists, if you like. And this is where I think agency becomes interesting, because one blurs what one might consider to be disciplinary cocoons. And so in doing so, we also sort of realized that we are making a case not for a particular building. We're really making a case for against the very idea of demolition, and that the very idea of demolition needs to be looked at much, much more critically than we do right now. And so we ran on hearing of the impending demolition. We, and when I say we, I mean Shubhra, Rajay, Riaz, Tayyabji, myself, but also we had a whole team of collaborators and many people who supported our efforts. So we wrote a letter to the director of the Indian Institute of Management and members of the governing council, urging them to reconsider their decision. And we used a simple Google document to solicit signatures. The response, the outrage was tremendous, and the response to sign the letter was tremendous. And it's quite possible that some of you in the audience might have also signed the letter, but really 235 academic institutions across the world signed the letter, including various Nobel Prize laureates and heads of several institutions. And really, it was very important for us to say that this was not about the hagiography surrounding Louis Kahn. We were we were at pains to say that this is not really about Louis Kahn. This is much beyond that, much larger than that. This is about the collective memory of an institution, about the legacy of a certain period of modernism, but also about this idea of building the institutions of modernism and a faith in institutions that was reminiscent of a certain time. I have to stress also that equally so, maybe even more so, is the idea of embodied energy and carbon, right? The idea of ecology, of which we are now much more aware, that is also embedded in these buildings. And so we believe that these buildings embody the collective memory of a fraternity that encompasses not only the IIM community, but also architects, academics, historians, and cultural critics. This collective memory acknowledges a continued relevance of the project through values of universal humanism that are imbued in the work. A critical reading of the campus's development reveals the fascinating transfer of authorships across various figures. And so here we were trying to sort of make the case that there are many people that have gone into the making of an institution, and we want to really not make this about one architect, but it is really about developing a certain ethos, a certain memory, a certain understanding of our own kind of histories. And we believe that these buildings should teach us also means of care and repair. And so with the delay of maintenance, the building requires not just material engagements, but often sophisticated technical interventions. Purely professional frames, divorced of empathy, distance us from our built environments, rather than enabling the potentials of intimacy. Acts of maintenance, repurposing, and reuse are not only the most ecological forms of living, they point to another ethos of world making. The building construction industry of today can be traced to an industrial age economy of extraction, production, use, and waste. So it is really about breaking this cycle and considering, what would it mean to consider an architecture of, to consider an ethos of care and repair. And so the vast amount of embodied energy that has gone into the production of the bricks and the concrete at IIMA should not be put to waste, right? This material should not become detritus in a spectacle of demolition. Rather, we must privilege the reuse and creative reprogramming of the dormitories, reinvent rituals of maintenance and repair, and in doing so, reiterate the aphorism that the most ecological building is the one that has already been built. Humanity is on course to triple material extraction in the next 30 years and triple waste production by 2100. This is analogous to adding the entire building stock of New York City every month for the next 40 years. Rapidly developing countries like India have an incredible opportunity and responsibility to demonstrate that other ways of world making, which are premised on ecology, empathy, and remembering, are not only possible, but crucial for our planet. So I'm going to sort of segue to another project, and these are a series of sort of quick projects that deal with history, that deal with memory, that deal with modernism, and this one deals with the idea of the museum, particularly Sanskar Kendra, the city museum by Corbusier in Ahmedabad. And so Corbusier was a huge critic of the old kind of European museum because it was the museum that came from the palaces, and the idea that royalty, think about the Louvre, should somehow dictate what is considered to be art, deeply upset Corbusier, and hence this provocative sentence, should the Louvre be burnt? And so his diatribe was against the museum as a static state and highly curated and closed entity. The thought that royal authority would somehow mandate what is considered art deeply infuriated Corbusier. And so he comes up with this very utopian project, which is this idea of a museum that can grow over time. And the search for a museum's ideal form becomes a career-long preoccupation for him from 1929 all the way up to his death. And what I find really interesting about this is that Corbusier, being the opportunist that he was, he sort of peddles this design to various cities across Europe. They all reject it, and it is finally built in Ahmedabad. But before it is built, he has this idea that a mason and a laborer should be permanently employed in the building, making this sort of a constantly growing project that would, in his view, would sort of constantly have art but also practices gathering in it. And it's, instead of art, I should say knowledge, because he's keen on sort of reframing this as a museum of knowledge. But here it is sort of trying to sell this in Paris, and pretty much the same building comes to Ahmedabad. But what is interesting is that in his earliest schemes, he is already talking about a certain lived idea of the museum, right? So the fact that these are already spaces of craft and studios that are part of this and this museum complex, and the goal really is to sort of break, I think, the divide between what is a museum building and these sort of smaller structures. All of these small structures are never built, and eventually he only builds 3 of these endless museums. None of them are endless, They are built in Ahmedabad, Tokyo, and Chandigarh, and they are absolutely the same architectural genotype taken from the Museum of Unlimited Growth. So they are all square introverted plans where the ramp, turns into a spiral folded upon itself. All of them have the so-called no facade because their growth is anticipated. And for the Museum of Unlimited Growth, again, this idea that the museum would grow literally is something that he sort of throws in there, but never really problematizes or never really develops, because he suggests that a mason and a laborer should be employed permanently in this act of rebuilding, but it is not developed ever in any of his later schemes. So yet 6 decades later, these museums or these buildings have become precisely the finite, static, and conventional museum entities that, the palace structures of Europe that Corbusier so heavily criticized. Their collections closed, their futures stayed, and more worryingly, in the case of Ahmedabad, the very existence of the building threatened by powerful real estate lobbyists, but also just by a serious lack of care and public engagement with the building. And so one of them becomes a World Heritage Site and one of them can be demolished. And so the fact that these museums arguably relate more to each other than to their local context becomes a point of departure for a design proposal that seeks to rejuvenate these sites and revive interest in their collective histories as a means of both critiquing and preserving their invaluable modernist legacies. The project proposes an itinerant pavilion which will serve as a temporary attachment to each of the museums. The pavilion will literally be transported across the 3 museum sites and be reassembled each time in a ritual of making and unmaking, evoking a formative agenda of the endless museum. It will also situate their futures towards projective, open-ended possibilities through rotating exhibitions, installations, and staged events as the pavilion migrates between sites. Through its itinerant condition, the pavilion will serve as an agent provocateur, activating key constituents, local stakeholders, diverse publics, as well as a larger community of artists and architects. And so this was a kind of a speculative project where I was really interested in what is the afterlife of these buildings, or what is the future of these buildings, and can it be somehow reconnected? Can it be opened up so that it really is something that is one of engagement? And there's a long tradition, of course, of the temporary pavilion. And can one do this through this idea of temporality? And this is, of course, the Itse Shrine, which is demolished and rebuilt every 20 years on an adjacent site in Japan, in a ritual that has lasted for over 1,000 years. And this I find very interesting, because if we care for our built environment, then we will almost never demolish anything, or we will never sort of neglect the institutions that it embodies. And hence this idea of both, in this case, the impermanence of things is not so much about the physical artifact, but it is very much also about developing rites and rituals that are about memory and about building a certain kind of social agency beyond the building. And so, and buildings can very much be part of these enactments, as the Itse Shrine shows us. And of course, the biggest example of this in India would be, the Kumbh Mela, which is this pop-up city, but is also, more importantly, the Mela itself that happens every 12 years across various sites in India. And within modernism also, there is a big tradition of the pavilion as a medium of experimentation and a critical vehicle embodying the zeitgeist. And this is, of course, the Philips Pavilion and the pavilion, the Spirit Nouveau, both temporary pavilions by Corbusier. And so I will go over this very quickly, but the idea is really that there's a frame system and a kind of infill system. And the infills sort of have their own kind of material ecologies and craft ecologies, and they kind of work in collaboration with, in a kind of endless dialectic with the frame system. So here you have them kind of coming together in Tokyo, in Chandigarh, as the pavilion would sort of move across these sites, activating and in a sense unraveling the contents of these museums. And also design studios that I've recently taught a studio at Cornell, where we were interested in sort of breaking the boundary condition, but also infiltrating the site of the Sanskar Kendra with practices of the city, and connecting the building and really embedding the building into the city in a way in which it would be completely unimaginable today. And I think a design studio sort of allows for this kind of strange or even perhaps extravagant speculation of what would it be to sort of really embed the building into the site, but also into the memory of the city, into the practices, the living practices of the city. And so we documented in great detail some of these practices, and we imagined, what would it be to have markets? What would it be to have other kinds of public spaces that one can imagine, that then begin to sort of climb into and out of the building and really engage with it. And I like this particular proposal because it looks at creating, again, something over time. This is inspired by James Sterling's Revi project in Lima, where he makes a similar diagram, where he proposes that there are multiple different outcomes of the building based upon a kind of DNA, an early sort of decision that can be sort of made and developed then over time. And some of these are really, like I said, quite over the top, but purposefully so. In this case, the proposal almost swallows the building, but it swallows the building through empathy, I would argue, through through the idea of making radical connections to it, and demonstrating what that would be like. And this brings me to the final and the last part of the chapter, which is really explicitly tied to this idea of world making and the pluriverse. And so world making is, as a term, sort of comes from Nelson Goodman in his book Ways of World Making, which is from the 1970s, where he sort of says that a building, more than most works of art, alters our environments physically, but moreover, as a work of art, it may, through various avenues of meaning, inform and reorganize our world. And so, like other works of art and scientific theories too, buildings can give new insights, advance understandings, participate in the continual remaking of the world. And I sort of borrow this notion of world making from Nelson Goodman in this way. There is another aspect of world making, not really called world making, but explicitly called worlding, and it comes from new materialisms and the work of people like Dana Haraway, which brings into focus and explains the significance of the innovative materialist critiques that are emerging across the social sciences and the humanities. And lastly, I want to sort of distance perhaps myself from world building, which is a term that really comes from fiction, and it comes from storytelling and from really things like Lord of the Rings, where it is much more about which is explicitly fictional, and I would like to argue that world making is explicitly not fictional. And so word making is also tied in this sense to ontology, to the way in which we think of ourselves in and of the world. And these are sort of two forms of word making. None of these are fictions. They are highly sort of real in terms of how they inform our worldviews. This is Pachamama on the left. Pachamama is the Andean goddess, and she's depicted with an immense amount of fecundity, with all of the creatures. And she is a feminine deity that represents sort of Mother Earth, but it's really a far more complex and perhaps even pagan deity that is Andean of the Americas. And contrasting that with the kind of Vitruvian man, with the sharp sort of geometries, the abstraction and the singular masculine human male is really, I think, an important kind of way in which two worldviews have been, these two worldviews have certainly been ossified in this way. And I would like to argue that the kind of non-Judeo-Christian, the rest of the world, the world outside of the Anglo-European modernist or Renaissance man trajectory has mostly embraced this other world, this world that is of multiplicities, this world that is a world where many other worlds can exist within this world, right? So this is a late 16th century manuscript of a Persian Ramayana owned by Hamida Banu Begum, the mother of the Mughal Emperor Akbar. I am fascinated by the multiplicity of life, the representation of reptiles, mammals, birds, fish, and humans. And there's a bit of architecture thrown in the background as well. And I find that this is this is 16th century quintessentially Hindu epic, the Ramayana. It doesn't get more Hindu epic than that. And it is retold through the medium of Islamic miniatures. The ontological flatness of the painting, that is the fact that this is not perspectival. It actually allows for the subject not to be seen in sort of perspective, but really for multiple. The flatness sort of allows for a reading, a flat reading of multiple simultaneous subjects. And so transition discourses take as their point of departure the notion that the contemporary ecological and social crises are inseparable from the model of social life that has been dominant over the past few centuries. And it really comes from the Vitruvian man here, where whether categorized as in industrialism, capitalism, modernity, neoliberalism, anthropocentrism, rationalism, patriarchy, or the Judeo-Christian civilization. Over the past few years, transition design has emerged as a multidisciplinary term across the humanities to advocate for epochal transformations rooted in the interconnectedness of social justice and ecological systems, calling for a new civilizational model. And this idea of a new civilizational model is really, I think, increasingly being spoken about, of course, outside of architectural circles. But I think that it is highly relevant to what we do as architects, and to imagine that other ways of world making are really possible. And the human being herself is not a singular entity, right? So this is Lynn Margulis, who is really the originator of this idea of symbiogenesis, and she sort of disputed Darwin, and now she's being credited by the fact that it was not survival of the fittest through that evolution happened, but it was really symbiogenesis, the idea that multiple different species are actually live within our own bodies. And at the time of the virus and COVID, I think this is really important to say that the coronavirus that is killing us right now is an outlier. You know, we have millions of viruses in our bodies, and we would perish without these organisms within us. And so really it is symbiosis and not the individual entity that is the foundation of life as we know it. And so we've had this, I borrow from Sarah Gunawan's thesis project, but you know, modernism has sort of taught us this way of thinking, and really, can we live with a kind of ambiguous relationship, or with a sort of not an extractive, not a kind of use and throw relationship with the world around us, but with really a relationship where many worlds can exist. And so if you consider mass extinction, and if you look at how food is produced, one starts to draw relationalities between these two things. And I was in London studying food systems in London, and I realized that, you know, this map really was revelatory, because these are all the food imports to the UK from every country in the world. And one really starts understanding this as part of a much more complex industrial big ag, right? Big industrial agriculture, in which a lot of architecture is implicated, right? So there is a whole series of grain silos, but also entire landscapes and farms that are embedded in bringing cheap food to us, and this is really destroying the planet as we know it. It's destroying the oceans. It's completely altered the way in which soil is fertile, and these mass modes. I mean, the recent farmers' protests in India are really symptomatic of this, where one is beginning to see this kind of big ag, very, very large corporations that are much more powerful than entire countries, and they are coming to really extract the last bits left of ecology and how food is produced. And so if you just look at how beef is produced in the United States, only 3% of it is really effective calories that go into beef production are consumed by people. So that is how ineffective that would be, or that is. And the pandemic really showed for us how fragile these systems actually are, right? And so there are only 4 large meat processing plants in the US for processing pork. And so when workers stopped coming to these places, pigs just had to be slaughtered, and it was just unbelievable, the kind of literally a kind of genocide that we see. And so these machinic architectures are the true enablers of the Anthropocene. For the total mass of farmed chicken exceeds the combined biomass of all other birds of on the planet. Furthermore, the biomass of humans and their domesticated animals outweighs that of all wild terrestrial vertebrates. With 23 billion chicken alive at any one time, humans have made engineered chicken the most numerous vertebrae, not just bird, vertebrae on the planet, a poignant symbol of the Anthropocene. Its distinctive bones will undoubtedly become fossilized markers of time when humans reigned the planet. And so while the turn of the century industrial agricultural complex was made, celebrated, and fetishized as the technological sublime, inspiring modern architectures, it is completely missing from contemporary accounts of architecture and visual culture. So we don't see these images at all. They're deliberately sort of removed from us. They're deliberately hidden from us. So as a provocation, and I'm really coming to the end here, so please bear with me. As a provocation, I would like to propose an alternative way of world making that implicates that implicates food systems, but actually only uses food systems as an excuse, as a ruse for a whole other way in which a whole other ethos of producing a world. So from the remains and detritus of the old economy, new alliances arise. The market symbiome is a localized post-pandemic experiment that connects places of growing, preparation, storage, and selling of food through a novel alliance of citizens, farmers, scientists, ecologists, consumers, immigrants, birds, bees, bats, butterflies, fish, bacteria, viruses, plants, and other non-humans. At once a hybrid building, network, landscape, and territory, unused and volunteered parcels of land, urban, peri-urban, and suburban building terraces, parts of building facades, defunct parking lots, lawns, golf courses, and underutilized sites are all fused and depaved across territories to create a market biome. And the market biome is a symbiome. It's an eco-restorative network of pollinator corridors, foraging landscapes, and biospheres comprising of synthetic constructs of the human and the natural world, brought together through myriad acts of symbiosis, generating its own microclimate, circulating its own energy and waste. It ensures it discards human and architectural autonomy in favor of what Donna Haraway calls sim and tonic partnerships. That is thick, layered, collaborative, symbiotic partnerships. It promotes a literal and ontological link between the scales of microbiota and those of the geographic biome. The market symbiome is a market. It includes the quotidian places of the city, its covered streets, temporary and pop-up markets, food kiosks, community kitchens, and cooperative farms, places of nightlife, leisure, collectively owned and administered by citizens and non-humans through acts of commoning that is, again, challenging the notion of private property itself. These are spaces of empowerment, quintessential institutions of public space, and the original incubators of small businesses, the markets, in an otherwise rapidly gentrifying global city. The market symbiome is its own thriving degrowth circular economy. It promotes acts of symbiosis, kinship, and sharing towards a steady state economy that is efficacious, but not always efficient. And so, one can get anaerobic digesters that convert food scraps into energy for buildings, compost for plants. And so everything here is kind of, I forgot to mention that this is sort of loosely located in London. I think I said that in the beginning of this research. And it's really to sort of take existing buildings and sort of build on them. So what if we started getting aviaries and places where one can kind of go much beyond things like the High Line, but really think about it as an ecological corridor that is connected. But as one starts going into defunct, decommissioned tunnels and air raid bunkers, which are, again, all over London. And I found it kind of incredible that some of this was already happening, that there was food being grown in the kind of Second World War abandoned bunkers, because the temperature there remains constant. And so it's possible to actually grow food even in the winter months using hydroponics. but more importantly, one completely obliterates food miles in the process. And so really, this is not a project per se, it is more of a provocation to imagine a much thicker, non-extractive world, and I will leave it at that. Thank you very much, and my apologies if I went over.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarosh. You were perfectly in time, and you really did what you mentioned in the beginning through your lecture, which is entanglement. And Can you hear me?
Yes.
So it was actually quite interesting to actually see the entire trajectory of your presentation. And one thing that I noticed was that one of the first projects which you showed of the Malawi project also had its bearing in food, and it also ended in food. Your presentation also ended in food. So that was quite a nice kind of framing. What I want to kind of point out is three things that really kind of stayed with me over your presentation, and then probably we can use these to open up more discussions. And in the meantime, I would also kind of invite the audiences to put their questions in the Q&A box. We are having a short conversation. The first. And all these three things you posed as ways of challenging modernist ideologies in some sense. The first idea that you gave is that of softening of boundaries, and softening of boundaries not just of the discipline, but also of the object of architecture, which was very interestingly demonstrated in the student projects that you sorry, not the student project, the projects that you kind of eventually showed. The second is you suggested that architects have an agency in voicing their kind of dissent against, and also you kind of suggested that softening of boundaries need not happen through erasure, but in fact finding ways of extending them or co-opting them or overlapping or
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
yeah. And that was a very interesting provocation, which was seen in particularly in the extension to the Sabarmati Ashram project that you showed,
The extension to Sanskar Kendra, I think.
Sorry, Sanskar Kendra. Sorry, mixing up.
But it could well be as a concept. It could well work with the Sabarmati Ashram, which I believe is also undergoing a major upheaval right now with a massive master plan. So
right, and just as we speak today, I read in the on someone's, in fact, Riaz's post that
yes,
the Shodhan House is under.
That is correct.
Under
the Shodhan House by Claude Bately. Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, this is on some of this unravels so quickly that it's sometimes even hard to pace some of those question marks that I had in my presentation. I didn't know if they were question marks or if they were crosses.
Yeah.
Because, for example, the three major institutions in Delhi, which are slated for demolition, some of them have already been emptied out. So who knows? I don't know if the demolition has started.
Absolutely, yeah. And then one more kind of idea that your presentation brought out is through building frameworks, extending frameworks. So these were quite interesting provocations to think of how to engage with these otherwise very tightly and inertly held modern projects, which was quite a kind of interesting takeaway. And the last one, which you kind of built up from these universal models constructed by modernism and modernist thinking itself, right from the Vitruvian man to the idea of perspective, which is located in the point of view of one person, into the multiverse or the pluriverse, which you spoke about, where you opened it very interestingly through questioning human centricism and kind of inverting it through ecologies of food, which was super interesting. And here I would really want you, because you also kind of hinted at it, if you could elaborate on the idea of food and private property. Uh, because I feel it's a very interesting connection that you make, because it was food, or let's say agriculture, which allowed societies to settle in a place, which also in some sense shaped fundamentally architecture. And now you are kind of re-questioning that to create. So in the sense, if we think of civilizationally, if we think of food as something that produces community of one of,
Yes,
and therefore
absolutely.
then how do we think of it to kind of re-entangle in your
Right, right, right. I mean, I think India, what is happening in India right now is really fascinating. Just to understand what agriculture is doing. What has happened in Punjab, for example, right? Just to understand how I think the last sector in the Indian economy that was shielded until last year, really, by the government through massive subsidies was agriculture. Otherwise, the 90s, everything had been already liberalized, but agriculture was not liberalized. I think that's very important, and 70% of our population is engaged in, or some version of that is engaged in agriculture, right? So the most of the people employed in the economy in that sense were not liberalized. And I think that what followed was this whole debate about, we cannot keep subsidizing agriculture, it has to be liberalized. And so we can then bring in technology. And, there was some, I don't dispute that, but I certainly dispute the fact that no alternative worldview can be imagined. We can either sort of subsidize it, or we can liberalize it. We have no other framework through which we can ask these questions. And I think that is a sort of failure of imagination. And also what is not discussed in that dialectic, right, in that dialogue or debate is the ecological problem. It's the fact that whether you liberalize it or you maintain the current system, our soils are dead, our rivers are dead. We have completely over, we have put in so much chemicals and fertilizers into the soils in Punjab that what used to be the green kind of bowl of the wheat bowl of the country is now the dust bowl, right? Like those soils are not productive. And so what would regeneration look like? I think that is the big question here. What would regeneration look like, and what would it mean to give agency to people and not to large corporations that are likely to get agency now, right? That the way in which these things have unfolded. And I think where it becomes interesting again is the pandemic, where when food systems failed, you found strange things happening. People still ate, but food was coming from in other ways. And I think the biggest takeaway for me has been that I don't think urban agriculture this is still a debate. Can urban agriculture, it's certainly in places like Detroit, it might be possible, right, where you've got vast expanses of the city that have been demolished, and caring for the ground, caring for the soil. Even in Pittsburgh, this is quite prevalent, that one can actually, like you said, create socialities around food. Right? Not only around the growing of food, but also around community kitchens and things like that. And I think this is where there's someone by the name of Stefan Gruber who works at, not to make a shameless pitch about Carnegie Mellon University, but really this idea of commoning that one can collectively own. And this is not at all new. I mean, think about Amul. Right? Amul is a cooperative collectively owned by farmers, and this idea that other models of collective ownership have not only existed in India for a long time, but have been very successful. What would a cooperative of architects look like? What would it look like to have collective ownership over certain things? And that means immediately a certain democratic way of negotiating, which is not polarizing, right? And I think that we need to desperately revive some of these older systems which have existed very much in our cultures. I came across builders, laborers cooperative in Kerala. That is a bunch. They are a group of laborers they've existed for 60 plus years, and they just make buildings, but they are not. I mean, they have escaped, therefore, this kind of migrant crisis which the labor construction force faces. Right. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's just to make the case that as architects, we have to imagine and even collaborate with and participate in other forms of world making, other forms of ownership and collaboration.
Yeah, in some sense, please correct me if I'm wrong. The way I'm understanding is that you're proposing that in engineering ecologies of food, there is a hope to communize property again.
Yes, of course, absolutely, and also, think it will radically change. For example, something like housing, right? Because now you can imagine you can potentially imagine a collective kitchen, a communal kitchen. So you don't have to design an apartment with. I mean, these things are not so bizarre, right? Like I can imagine that some kitchens might be, or maybe they are not kitchens. Maybe there are other spaces.
No, certainly. In fact, in several communities of China, they still have a common kitchen within neighborhoods, and the kitchen always has an external door, so anyone can enter and exit.
It was more common in communist, also I believe in the Soviet Union, but I would like to think that for example, the balcony has always been a place like that in Indian cities. And I think that there are ways in which imagining what would those common, and also I think what's very interesting is we already have a certain looseness of boundary, right? That is very much part of our kind of ethos. And I think capitalizing on developing such frameworks, imagining what other kind of productive spaces one can develop would allow for the beginnings of other ways of world making.
Right. Yeah. I just want to kind of take a question that has occurred in our Q&A box. It's by Poonam Verma. Poonam Verma is saying that brilliant to see you and hear you at length, but missed one aspect within the lexicon on politics of world making. How do we address that?
So I'm not sure if I understand the question. The politics. I mean, we are talking about it. This is the entire talk is to sort of make a case for engagement and to say that architects can no longer sort of be. And I think this was also quite nicely framed in your building agency, the early part, which is on your website, which is to say that after the 90s, architects became a service industry in India, and we and also I think it was rightly said that entire period of architecture produced either a certain kind of boutique second farmhouse kind of architecture, but I think what it implies, what was not said but said in that line, was that we turned our backs to our cities as architects, and we gave the kind of platform to other professionals who did what those professions do well, like planning, right?
Yeah.
And so somehow and I think this idea of retaking the city is already happening in places like Bandra with the Bandra Collective of architects, right? So I can see that happening in parts of India, but largely the kind of overall sort of climate is still one where you try to find, and this is a very important point. So thank you, Poonam, for the question. Where the model of practice is client based, right? So you start a practice and you just imagine that you are going to get the best, the most, the dream client, which is sort of setting yourself up for a certain kind of failure, which I've realized very late in my career, right? That there is no such thing as the perfect client, but there is such a thing as perhaps pursuing your own project. And here I also draw the distinction between practice and project. That is something that Stan Allen talks about, which is to say that practice is something that is sort of tactical, strategic. You work, you run a firm, and you get projects. But project can be a lifelong thing, right? Project can be the idea of commoning can be a lifelong project, right? So project is something that far extends beyond practice. World making can be a project.
Yeah, and that's such an essential thing we are trying to work on, because I was just trying to kind of articulate that I think we are, at least in India, we are in a moment where 30 years we are in a moment 30 years after the liberalization, and we are ready to kind of take stock of what has happened in the last 30 years. And we are realizing that we are unhappy with what unfolded. And so I think there is a huge push in kind of readdressing, realigning with the politics, the question that Poonam also
asked.
And that's where, groups like the Bandra Collective and so many other such architectural formations are also kind of emerging.
And I think as educators, right, as people who teach in universities, it behooves us to tell our students that other ways of practice, other ways of engagement are not only possible, but they are foundational. They are essential. Yes. They are essential, because otherwise we will only be doing boutique architecture, and we won't have a profession or a discipline left.
Yes, and discipline that inquires, and like you said, it kind of architecture is a form of knowledge, for the
right,
which produces and leaves questions for the world.
Right.
Yeah, that's certainly very, very crucial, and at the heart of at least our institution, and we try to mobilize them through our discussions.
Yeah, I have to say that is also true at Carnegie Mellon. I joined Carnegie Mellon during a pandemic, and I was amazed by some of the conversations that have unfolded over the past 2 year and more now, year and a half here. And they are all around, we are calling them pedagogies conversations. It's worth looking up. They're all on our website, but they're all around questions of agency. And it has been framed as 3 broad questions that really are global questions. They are not particular. I mean, all of these questions have very particular local manifestations, but it is around climate change. That is the first one. The second one is justice. And I think that, we have to thank our former president in the US for that, right? The idea that justice is something that has to be foregrounded. I say thank, very ironic. I mean, obviously I'm poking fun, but so the second one is justice. And then the third one is artificial intelligence, because again, artificial intelligence is something that is so pervasive, but it is stealth. It is not seen, but it exists right now in me uttering sentences to you. There is probably some system that is artificially looking at my so there's something very dark going on with artificial intelligence, but potentially also liberating if we can find ways of harnessing it well.
Yeah, totally.
But these are questions being asked in an architecture school. right? We are not, I mean, Carnegie Mellon is one of the best institutions in the world from a technological standpoint, but we are asking them in the premise of an architecture school.
Absolutely. And taking from the last point, and tying it to what Keller Easterling theorizes, about extra statecraft, and how we are getting inscribed into these universalizing patterns of AI and scripts of technology and infrastructure is something alarming, and we definitely need to kind of be more agile towards them and be able to dance on them rather than be trapped into them. And I think this is what will particularly take a unique kind of thinking and keep the agency of architects alive. So yeah, that's very kind of alarming at this point to think on. So I think that brings us to our to the end of our conversation, because I don't see any questions. Let me just check if anyone has raised their hand.
I see Poonam's asked one additional question, which is
Yes.
when the government and major part of society is aspirational to the perceived idea of development and primarily the forces of demolition. So the idea that demolition is peddled as development, right? Demolition is development. How does the profession engage? And I think that what I hope is that our very, very small glimpse of the campaign that we did, but we were a tiny part of a much larger campaign that gained a lot of attention against the demolition of the Indian Institute of Management dormitories, and hopefully that showed how the profession can engage, right? So Puno's question is, how can the profession engage? By activism is one way. I mean, there are many, many ways. I try to show 3 forms of engagement: through building, through activism, and through world making, right? So I'm sure that there are others and that there are many different ways of engagement, but one has to sort of first accept that this dualism, I've become very wary of dualisms, right? So development or demolition, modernity, or like, we don't have to sort of build the world in dualisms, but we really need to build a pluriversal world.
Yeah, the aspect of coexisting,
right?
Being able to kind of work with
and coexisting, as Salman Rushdie pointed out, is sometimes being able to take critique, right? Being able to take even insult, right? You don't have to kill the other person, but you can decide to switch off the television, or to go to another TV channel, or not watch the movie, or not buy the book. But it doesn't have to be a kind of my way or the highway.
Yeah.
But there can be another way of existing. Of course, one hopes it doesn't come to that. One hopes that one can build symbiosis, right?
Yeah. So, and I think that's a very good point to end, in fact, this entire series. We are very, very happy, Sarosh, that this lecture kind of happened at the end of this series, because it so well encapsulates everything that we have been discussing in the past 7 lectures. And I think over the 8 sessions that we have had so many people showing interest in this aspect of social design, and really kind of the series has helped us kind of formulate a kind of pedagogical, a possible pedagogical course also, which requires attention. And in that kind of spirit, we are definitely going to be in touch with you and with all our speakers to be able to put together some thoughts in a more coherent and cogent way, and do something which is more relevant to the times that we need to address as architects today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. Thanks.
And I want to thank all the audience. And our series Building Agency comes to an end today. And so we'll come up with our next kind of series very soon and announce it. So we look forward to your participation and enthusiastic discussion. So on that note, have a good evening and happy Dashera.
Happy Dashera. Thank you.